Hey guys, coming at you from Macau for another quick update, which will actually be kind of a follow-up on yesterday's podcast about discrimination in China. This is the benefit of this audio format here. I can just fire up my microphone and start talking, allowing me to get out content quite a bit more easily. The reason I wanted to make a follow-up video here is because yesterday's podcast sparked some really interesting discussions and generally had a pretty wide division of takes on the situation. Nearly everyone agreed the video of the woman being forced to eat outside the restaurant while her daughter and Chinese husband were allowed to eat inside looked highly suspicious. In line with what I said about not being sure how real it is, the audio in the video makes it slightly more convincing, and I went through my head beforehand about all the possible scenarios that could explain why they'd choose to still eat there. From whether the husband showed up first and ordered food only to realize his wife couldn't enter, to there being not many other choices available, or maybe perhaps the daughter just really wanted to eat there. It turned out to be a restaurant in Chengdu, so I've got someone who might be able to find out a little bit more soon. Theories that came in as to why she wasn't let in, if it is indeed real, included her running a slight fever, although you'd think her whole family wouldn't be let in then, or that she didn't have the required health QR code to show the person at the door, which would have discriminated against anyone, regardless of where they were from, if you didn't have one. Regardless, with the level of fear that's going on now, it's completely feasible that something like this could happen. The fear of foreigners re-importing this virus into China is happening at such an unfortunate time as well, because it wasn't too long ago that a new policy suggestion was made in China to open up more PR cards to foreigners living here, and it sparked a lot of debate with an overwhelming amount of negative comments about the proposal from locals. While this was one of the elements and considerations that drove me to make yesterday's podcast, I didn't talk about it because it's a whole separate rabbit hole that would be really hard to relate with people on. The fear and uncertainty and resistance that would come from a country that is for the first time ever looking to open up immigration in a major way comes with a set of reactions that almost no non-racist Westerner living alive in a developed nation could empathize with, because their countries have been open to immigration for so much longer. Therefore, talking about the problems with the feedback that came up from the new PR card proposals would unfairly paint China as far more racist than it really is. There are, of course, racists here, and a commenter did mention one of the slurs he was called after the heated online discussion surrounding when this proposal came out in the real world, to clarify. But I don't believe the widespread resistance to such a massive proposal to change the entire face of how immigration works in China should be labeled as broadly racist, at least without considering the depth of this change. I'm not going to get deeper into the PR issue today, but I wanted to let you know about one of the background elements which did go into some of the smaller conclusions in yesterday's podcast. Now, onto the divides that I saw in the comments. We had a mix of people saying that you've got to understand this is a pretty special time, and others who were a bit disappointed to hear about the profiling going on in China. Although here you notice I dropped the word racial from the beginning of what is usually called racial profiling, it still is in many ways. The reason I'm clarifying this point is that because there are many people who made the valid comment that this isn't a race thing per se, and that Chinese people from Wuhan would have been treated the same or worse during this situation. It's an equally unfortunate situation, but it's quite a bit more difficult to figure out just by looks alone if someone is from Wuhan, unless they're really good at picking up specific regional accents. So now, considering that it's easier to identify a foreigner, and the concern is bringing coronavirus back in from overseas, we can now profile people based on their skin color to identify who is the risk here. Warranted or not, no matter how you feel about it, this is called racial profiling. An interesting part for me was seeing the divide between people who thought this was okay and who thought it wasn't okay. The idea that this is a pretty natural reaction and people could see where it's coming from was a more universal sentiment that transcended across both sides. In relation to Chinese acting nervous around foreigners in China or refusing to get into an elevator with them, it's an interesting thing to wrap your head around, and it's the kind of event that can really spark reflection in ourselves. Is it okay this time because we're talking about something that's serious enough now? Is it okay to racially profile people in order to avoid someone who might put you and your family at more risk? If it's okay this time, how does it make you feel about people in Western countries refusing to get into elevators with ethnic groups they perceive as being at a higher propensity to commit crimes, or locking their car doors when someone of that ethnicity walks by them when they're sitting in their cars? Is it okay for police to pull them over more or ID check them more because of these same reasons also. Whether you think these situations are different enough or not, these are still important questions and thoughts to run through. It's important to remind yourself to be consistent and avoid hypocrisy by abiding by these principles. It forces you to ask some really uncomfortable questions and deeply analyze your position. It could also lead to really interesting epiphanies. My commitment to these principles is why I had to say something yesterday when I felt like we are potentially slipping into a concerning direction. How could I continue making videos talking about overseas Chinese who haven't been to China in years being targeted, or Chinese kids being separated at school, or being the only ones asked to wear a mask on their school bus, and not mention when I see signs of something developing in the opposite direction? The truth in my belief that China is a great place and there are so many positives that people don't know about may make it seem like that is my side. But in fact, it just comes from a place of authenticity. And it's from that very same authenticity that my need to raise the alarm on this kind of issue comes from. I did notice a lot of my commenters who tried to excuse and explain the behavior that's going on in China didn't try to do the same thing when I spoke about discrimination against overseas Chinese. Let's examine that hypocrisy in a bit more detail. Of course, excluding the violent attacks that happen overseas, which are in a whole separate category of evil. I'm not saying the apparent hypocrisy of these particular commenters comes from a place of deliberate, malicious intent. Because, of course, these commenters perhaps understand China more than they do overseas. But this is still an extremely valuable experience for them because it can force them to consolidate their thoughts and reflect on how they feel about seeing these kinds of things happen overseas, and the intensity of the judgments and conclusions that they come to. In effect, they are learning more about the world by simply reflecting from within. There are one of two ways this could take them. It could either cause them to empathize more with the situation and dynamics overseas, or it could cause them to be more critical about what's happening at home. The example I am talking about here, of course, extends in the opposite direction also, with those who were not critical of overseas Chinese being targeted, but are suddenly critical of foreigners being targeted in China. A perfect example of a commenter who is more worldly in their views and has already consolidated a consistent, non-hypocritical viewpoint is one who said they kind of understand the fears of Chinese people in China. And as an overseas Chinese, she even avoided Chinese restaurants during the beginning of this breakout, not knowing if any of their guests had recently returned from China. This was an extremely balanced position. I think I'll wrap this one up here, but I do want to let my subscribers know and who have gotten the impression that I'll be sticking to a strict type of narrative. That's not the case. As I mentioned, my content in relation to China naturally turns out to be more towards the positives without much effort, because there are so many positives that people aren't talking about. But that doesn't mean I won't call out interesting and unusual negatives, so you have been forewarned. Actually, I have a suggestion to make to those who are offended by that idea. Be more constructive and less insulting when you encounter other people doing the same thing. In fact, for me, it's okay. I'm okay if you do that here. The worst that will happen is sometimes I get a bit combative in the comments and have to catch myself, but I enjoy that. However, this suggestion comes from a realization of what oftentimes happens to other people, and for that I will tell you a story. So there's another content creator who I had been friends with for a very long time, and they warned me that the moment I make a video talking about the negatives on China, I'll get attacked. I didn't really find that there was anything that would constitute as an attack in the comments of yesterday's podcast, but it certainly did provoke a lot of debate. Now, his suggestion was probably born from reactions to his more kind of inflammatory, unfair, and poorly concluded videos. I'm not trying to paint my videos as a standard of what to call well concluded, but I do feel like I go a bit deeper and use appropriate amounts of benefit of doubt. However, when this person was attacked by another, what I'd call pro-China YouTuber, long before I was a content creator, I reached out to him to show him support and say that it was pretty crappy what they did to you. His response was that this kind of stuff isn't going to make him speak more positively about China. It will do the opposite, and the gloves are off now. So that brings me back to my suggestion. Calling people out on their BS is important, but try to do it in a constructive way. Maybe it will still end up with the same result, but it provides a better chance to engage the world in a more constructive way. Because people don't take criticism well, and some are so sensitive that they'll deliberately push more in the other direction against you, as some sort of a childish, deliberate protest. reaching new levels of unreasonability or dishonesty just to stick it to you. Hearing about his experiences before I started this was very valuable because it allowed me to see this phenomena from afar, preparing me before I entered for the types of things to recognize from a psychological standpoint at least. So once again, you're free to say whatever you want here, but I thought I'd put this out there as a possible way to encourage a type of engagement with others in a way where we could potentially see less of this side picking and less of people being pushed further and further into their own individual corners. All right, guys, that's it from me. As usual, stay safe, take all the precautions you should be taking during these days, and I will see you in the next update. Peace.